Deep in the mountains of Gira, Nani ran as fast as her short blue legs could carry her. She was running for her life, and clutched in her arms was her baby, a boy no more than 6 months old. In her heart was only terror. She ran like a bat out of hell. Every fibre of her being and every ounce of her spirit went into her legs as she fled. She trampled through the underbrush and stumbled down the slope, falling again and again, but always rising, always running. Blood streamed down her limbs and face from innumerable cuts and scrapes. Her legs screamed with pain, and she struggled to breathe. But she kept running, for her pursuer was fire. Flames ripped through the trees and brush with malice, raging, rampaging, and ravishing through the drought-dried forest like an avalanche of all-consuming smoke and fire. Flames danced across the forest canopy in a perverse race against the blaze on the ground, devouring the underbrush. Trees splintered and exploded in the heat. The dry foliage that littered the ground went up like kindling as the dry summer wind propelled the blaze further and further. Rocks cracked in the sustained heat of the smouldering ashes left behind by the blaze. Nani kept running. Her only hope lay a few hundred yards away. Her sole chance for life was a dry creek bed, a dainty dish that could hold the besieging flames at bay while she ran for her life. Tears streamed down her face as she pounded through the brush. Her baby coughed and wheezed. His little blue face was turning pink while he hacked and hacked, spitting up globs of blackened phlegm onto his mother's smoke-stained shirt. She began to despair, but the trees started to thin. She ran even faster as the sight of the creek bed in the distance gave her a second wind. She wanted to shout for joy as she reached the creek. But right in her moment of triumph, disaster struck. Her foot landed wrong on the loose rock, and her ankle bent and then snapped. She howled with pain as she face-planted onto the bank of the creek. Nani knew this was her and her child's end. She was lightheaded, her lungs burned, and her heart was pounding out of her chest. Her baby's breathing was laboured and shallow, and blood trickled from a cut across his forehead. Her head spun, and her vision dimmed. Acrid black smoke billowed in through the wall of dead trees. The fire was only 500 yards away. She began to fall into a heat, smoke, and exhaustion-fueled stupor, but she was awoken from the trance by the distant roaring of an aircraft engine. Nani screamed in rage and desperation as she tried to get up, but she fell as soon as she put weight on her broken ankle. She screamed until the only sound that came from her throat was a dry squeak, and pounded on the dusty creek bed until her hand was bloody and numb. The fire was only 300 yards away. Nani rolled onto her back and stared at the sky, while she ran her fingers through her barely breathing baby's hair. The columns of smoke over the creek bed began to get thicker and darker as the wind pushed the inferno closer and closer. The fire was only 100 yards away. Nani began to sing her death song, although it only came as a whisper. She was halfway through it when she heard movement in the distance. The fire was only 50 yards away. Nani thought she was hallucinating when she started to hear voices shouting in an alien tongue. She could only stare wide-eyed as humans in helmets and rucksacks marched past her, heading towards the fire. They started cutting down trees with chainsaws and dug with strange tools that mixed an axe head and a shovel. 2 humans, one a man, the other a woman, both with big red bags on their backs, came to her and knelt. The man put a needle in her arm and attached it to a sack of fluid, which he held aloft while the woman brought out an oxygen mask and an inhaler from her bag and administered them to Nani and her baby. She then put a needle in the baby's arm and handed the bag of fluid to the man, freeing her hands to splint Nani's ankle. Nani's breathing eased after just a few minutes, and she felt a cool sensation in her body. Now more alert, she held her baby tight and watched in amazement, horror, and confusion as the fire grew closer and closer. She could barely breathe with the mask on, and the humans worked without anything covering their faces. but it seemed that, if anything, the smoke fortified them rather than poisoned them. She couldn't comprehend how they could operate with such poor equipment. Just a single Giran fire mech cost 100 times more than everything the small band of humans had combined. They were dressed in clothes that seemed to offer no protection from the fire. Blackish green pants, flimsy yellow shirts, and flimsy plastic helmets. They worked with hand tools straight out of the Iron Age. There was not a single piece of modern technology in sight. And most ridiculous of all were their boots. She had only ever seen leather in museums, and the leather on the firefighters' boots was so worn and creased that they looked in worse repair than 10,000-year-old boots. Some of the firefighters even had mismatched laces. Yet even still, they dug and dug, doubling their efforts instead of running in the face of certain death. But it was to no avail. The fire was too close. Nani pulled her baby into a deathly tight embrace and closed her eyes as the fire reached the wide and shallow trench the humans had dug in front of the creek. She expected to die at any moment, but instead of screams, she heard cheers. Nani opened her eyes. The fire was stopped in its tracks. The humans had done it, but they wasted little time celebrating. They kept on digging and began clearing the foliage behind the creek as well. In the distance, she could hear the sound of some kind of strange aircraft. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and louder. Nani looked up and saw an aircraft that resembled the body of a fish, with a fan stuck atop it. Dust was blown into her eyes as the aircraft pitched up, slowing to a hover. She shielded her baby with her body and squinted up, dumbfounded, as a rope bearing a man and a stretcher was lowered from the hovering aircraft. The two medics who had assisted her, and the man on the rope, all helped to pull Nani and her baby onto the stretcher. Once she and her child were strapped in, the stretcher was pulled back into the helicopter. Once inside, she was met by a small Giran medical team, which began to examine her and her baby immediately. While the medical team checked her vitals, Nani pulled aside her oxygen mask and, with a hoarse voice, asked, "Who were they?" One of the Giran medics answered reverently, "Hotshots."